Hello, folks. Welcome. There's been a lot of talk online about the whole thing with the motor trend developments.
For nearly a decade, Ian Roussel was one of the most recognizable names in custom car fabrication television. Viewers knew him as a calm, methodical builder who could turn a rusty heap of scrap metal into something that looked like it belonged in a museum. But somewhere between the show's premiere and its quiet conclusion, something shifted. And to understand what actually happened, it helps to separate what's genuinely documented about Ian Roussel's career from the exaggerated, dramatized versions of his story that have circulated online. This is the version built on what can actually be verified. Ian Roussel was born on November 19, 1970, in Sunland, California, a small community tucked into the foothills on the northern edge of Los Angeles. Long before cameras ever found him, Roussel was already immersed in the world of metal and machines. According to account of his upbringing, his father Jerry was a car enthusiast who brought that passion into their home, and Ian spent much of his childhood at his father's side, absorbing the basics of fabrication and mechanical work. By the time he was around 8 years old, he was reportedly already welding together frames for homemade go-karts, a detail that, whether or not every specific number attached to it over the years is accurate, lines up with the same story Roussel and those close to him have told consistently. He didn't discover car building as an adult hobby. It was simply how he grew up. That early exposure shaped the rest of his life. Rather than treating fabrication as something to study formally, Roussel treated it as something to practice constantly. He graduated high school in 1989, and instead of following a more conventional path to college or a structured apprenticeship, he pushed directly into Southern California's custom car scene, a world that, at the time, was still dominated by word-of-mouth reputations and garage-built portfolios rather than resumes. Within a few years, by his early 20s, Roussel had opened his own shop. That alone was notable. Most builders who reach any level of industry recognition spend a decade or more working under someone else first. Roussel skipped that step and built his name largely on his own. What set him apart in those early years wasn't marketing or connections. It was a simple willingness to take on builds other shops turned away. Custom fabrication, especially work that involves blending components from different eras and vehicle types, is unpredictable and labor-intensive, and plenty of shops prefer to stick to more straightforward restoration work. Roussel leaned the opposite direction. He built a reputation for saying yes to unconventional requests, which meant his shop increasingly attracted clients who wanted something that didn't exist yet, rather than a faithful reproduction of something that already did. That approach eventually connected him to a slightly larger stage. Before he ever had his own television series, Roussel appeared in a handful of automotive documentaries and shows that were already circulating in enthusiast circles, including Back from the Dead, Hot Rod documentary, and its sequel, along with an appearance on the competition series Car Warriors. These weren't the kind of high-profile placements that instantly make a career, but they mattered in a niche industry where visibility is everything. Being featured in projects that automotive enthusiasts were already watching put his name and his work in front of exactly the audience that would eventually follow him to his own show. The origin of that show is one of the better documented parts of his story. Around 2003, Roussel put together a DVD showcasing his fabrication work, originally intended simply as a demonstration reel, the kind of thing a shop might use at a trade show booth or hand to a prospective client. That DVD ended up reaching people connected to MAVTV, the motorsports-focused cable network. It's worth being honest about the timeline here. More than a decade passed between that DVD circulating and an actual show reaching air. Television development is notoriously slow, involving pilot episodes, pitch revisions, and long stretches of uncertainty about whether a project will ever be picked up at all. Roussel's case followed that same frustrating, unglamorous pattern rather than some overnight discovery story. Full Custom Garage finally premiered on MAVTV in March 2014. From the outset, it distinguished itself from a lot of reality television built around manufactured conflict. The format centered on Roussel and his small team, including fabricators Tom Flores and Victor Cacho, working through builds from start to finish, with attention coming from the actual mechanical and design problems in front of them rather than scripted arguments between cast members. Over the years that followed, the show ran for 9 seasons, airing its final episodes in January 2024. Along the way, it also spun off an additional project for Amazon Prime titled Custom Cars, Lead Sleds, Back from the Dead with Ian Roussel, extending his reach beyond Mob's core audience. The individual builds featured across those 9 seasons give a better sense of what the show actually was in any summary can. One episode centers on Roussel taking on a 1948 Packard that a friend wanted transformed into a street-cruising lead sled, the low-slung, smooth-out custom style that traces back to the hot-rodding movement of the 1950s. The car arrives in rough shape, and the episode follows the unglamorous reality of that kind of build. Cutting, reshaping, and fighting a decades-old body that was never designed to be modified this way. Another episode follows Roussel reviving an abandoned trike from the 1970s, bringing in a specialist he refers to as a trike guru to help work through problems specific to 3-wheel builds, and turning what skeptics assumed was a lost cause into a functioning custom vehicle. These weren't isolated cases. They were representative of the show's core structure. Nearly every episode followed the same basic shape. An unlikely starting vehicle, a client or personal reason for wanting it transformed, and a process-driven middle section that spent real time on the mechanical decision-making rather than skipping straight to a reveal. That structure is worth dwelling on, because it says something about why the show built the loyal following it did. A lot of build-focused reality television leans heavily on time-lapse montages, dramatic countdown clocks, and a narrow before and after framing that treats the actual labor as an obstacle to rush past on the way to a reveal shot. Viewer commentary on Full Custom Garage over the years has tended to single out the opposite quality, that the show slowed down enough to let people actually watch Roussel solve problems, sketch out proportions, and explain why one approach to a panel or a chassis modification made more sense than another. For an audience made up largely of people who either build cars themselves or wish they had the skills to, that emphasis on process over spectacle was part of the appeal. It's worth pausing here on a point where a lot of secondhand retellings of Roussel's story go further than the evidence supports. Numerous online articles and videos, many of them nearly identical to one another, recycling the same phrasing and dramatic beats, claim specific, vivid details about his personal life. A birth certificate discrepancy tied to an earthquake, an exact hour-by-hour childhood workshop log, a heat exhaustion collapse on set, a dramatic on-camera resignation quote, a desert home near Furnace Creek, a specific dollar figure for a farewell build, and a stated decision about having children. None of these claims trace back to a credible, original source. No interview, no reporting outlet, no statement from Roussel himself that could be verified. They appear to have originated in the same genre of mass-produced, untold truth content that repurposes a celebrity's name with invented specifics designed to sound authoritative. Because of that, none of those details are repeated here. What can be said with confidence is more modest, but it's real. After 9 seasons, Full Custom Garage concluded its run on MAVDV in early 2024, and Roussel's public presence shifted increasingly toward a platform he controlled directly. That platform is his YouTube channel, Full Custom Ian. Rather than framing it as an act of rebellion against television, it's more accurate to describe it as a continuation of the same work through a different structure. The channel's own description emphasizes what has always defined Roussel's approach: hand-built fabrication done without relying on bolt-on parts, CAD design or modern shortcuts, building from raw metal and scrap rather than assembling from a catalog of pre-made components. That's consistent with the identity he built over more than 2 decades in the industry, long before any camera was involved. It's worth putting that philosophy in context, because it's not a small distinction inside the custom car world. It's closer to a dividing line. Modern automotive customization has increasingly leaned on tools that didn't exist for earlier generations of builders. CAD software that lets a shop design a panel digitally before ever touching metal, prefabricated frame kits, bolt-on suspension components, and CNC cut parts that can be ordered rather than shaped by hand. Those tools have made customization faster and more accessible, and plenty of respected shops use them, without controversy. But there's also a segment of the custom fabrication world, the segment Roussel has consistently placed himself in, that treats hand-formed metalwork as the actual craft, and treats the shortcuts as a different, lesser skill set entirely. English wheels, sheet metal shaping by eye, hand-cut and hand-welded frame modifications. These are slower, less forgiving, and far less common today than they were in the mid-20th century, when they were simply how car customization was done because no other option existed. Builders who've maintained those skills into the C80 era and built entire businesses around them occupy a fairly small and respected corner of the industry. That's the corner Roussel has occupied since well before full custom garage ever existed. And it's the same corner his YouTube channel continues to represent. That consistency matters for understanding what actually changed with the move to YouTube, because the honest answer is less than the dramatic retelling suggests. The techniques didn't change. The willingness to take on difficult, unconventional requests didn't change. What changed was the format surrounding the work, who controlled the pacing, who owned the footage, and who decided what got cut. Those are meaningful differences for a working builder, but they're production differences, not a personal reinvention. The shift to YouTube also reflects something bigger than one builder's individual choice. The automotive television landscape changed substantially around the same period Roussel's show wound down. In November 2024, it was publicly reported that Motor Trend Productions, the company behind long-running programs like Roadkill and several of its spin-offs, was shutting down its production operations, a move tied to broader financial pressures within its parent company, Warner Brothers Discovery. Multiple established automotive shows lost their production backing in a short span of time, and hosts across the industry found themselves needing to decide whether to chase another network deal or build independent audiences on platforms like YouTube, where they retain more creative control and a more direct relationship with viewers. It isn't accurate to say that specific shutdown directly caused the end of full custom garage, since the shows operated under different production arrangements, but it does capture the environment Roussel and builders like him were operating in. Traditional cable and streaming deals for niche automotive content were becoming less stable, while independent platforms were becoming more viable. For someone whose entire career had been built on hands-on craftsmanship rather than performance, that shift toward a self-directed platform makes sense on its own terms, without needing an invented breakdown or on-set collapse to explain it. Television production, even under the best circumstances, imposes real constraints. Fixed episode lengths, air date deadlines, and a need to shape footage into something that holds a broad audience's attention within a defined runtime. A YouTube channel doesn't carry those same constraints. Builds can run however long they need to. Roussel's own channel reflects that flexibility, with videos of varying lengths depending on the complexity of the project rather than a fixed broadcast slot. His wife, Jamie Roussel, has also become a visible part of that transition. Public videos on the full custom Ian channel show the two of them discussing her role and future involvement with the channel, indicating that the operation has functioned as a shared effort rather than a solo venture, consistent with the way many independent creator channels in the automotive space are run, where a partner handles production, editing, or business management alongside the person doing the mechanical work on camera. This pattern isn't unique to Roussel, and it's worth understanding why so many television-era car builders have followed a similar path in recent years. For most of the genre's history, automotive build shows lived on cable networks that controlled the entire relationship between builder and audience. The network owned the footage, set the release schedule, negotiated the advertising, and ultimately decided whether a show got renewed at all. A builder could have a loyal, engaged fan base and still see their show canceled because of a corporate restructuring that had nothing to do with the quality of the work, which is essentially what played out industry-wide when Warner Brothers Discovery's financial pressures led to the shutdown of Motor Trend Productions and the end of shows like Roadkill that had run for well over a decade. YouTube inverted that relationship. A builder with an existing audience could take that audience with them, monetize directly through the platform and through their own merchandise and sponsorships, and answer to viewers rather than a programming executive deciding what counted as broadcast ready. For someone like Roussel, who had already spent a decade proving there was a real audience for slow, process-heavy build content, that shift represented less of a risk than it might have for a newer, less established name. There's also a generational element to this shift that's easy to overlook. The custom car television genre itself traces back to shows and personalities, figures like Boyd Coddington and Chip Foose, both of whom Roussel has cited as early influences on his own development as a builder, who came up in an earlier media landscape, one where a single hit cable show could define an entire career for a decade or more. That model assumed a level of stability in television that simply doesn't exist anymore for niche, enthusiast-driven programming. Builders entering the industry today, or transitioning out of cable run the way Roussel did, are working within a completely different set of incentives, and platforms like YouTube have become less of an alternative and more the default expectation. Roussel's standing in the industry, meanwhile, doesn't appear to have diminished with the show's end. He continues to be described by outlets covering custom car culture as one of the more respected independent fabricators working today. Someone whose name still carries weight among enthusiasts who value from-scratch metalwork over parts catalog builds. Estimates of his net worth circulating online vary widely. Some place it around $1 to $2 million, others considerably higher, but none of these figures come from a disclosed, verifiable source, and they should be treated as the rough public speculation they are rather than confirmed fact. What actually happened to Ian Roussel, then, is less a story of scandal or forced departure, and more a story of an industry in transition, and a builder who had the flexibility and the existing following to move with it rather than get stuck waiting for the next network deal. He spent more than 2 decades establishing himself as a serious fabricator before television ever entered the picture, spent roughly 10 years building a reputation through full custom barrage, and then, as the broader cable and streaming landscape for niche automotive content grew shakier, redirected that same audience toward a channel he owns and runs on his own terms. It's a far less sensational story than the collapse, burnout, and walked-away narratives that have been attached to his name across dozens of nearly identical online videos and articles. But it's also a more honest one, a career built the same way as cars are, piece by piece, over a long stretch of time, without shortcuts. That distinction matters beyond just one builder's biography. The flood of near-identical untold truth and devastating tragedy content that now surrounds public figures, including relatively low-profile ones like a custom car fabricator with a cable following, has become common enough that it's worth naming directly. These pieces tend to share a recognizable formula, a birth detail turned into a mystery, an exact but unverifiable number attached to childhood hours or dollar figures, a medical emergency invoked for drama, and a resignation quote presented as if it were recorded rather than invented. The formula works because it's genuinely hard, as a viewer, to tell which details in any given video are sourced and which are simply plausible-sounding filler. The best defense against that isn't cynicism about every builder's story. It's checking what's actually attributable to an interview, a network statement, or a documented public record, and treating everything else as unconfirmed, no matter how specific or emotionally compelling it sounds.